Welcome back to GBNAmerica, where I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. E.J. Antoni, a research fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Grover M. Herman Center for the Federal Budget. Well, Dr. Antoni, thank you for coming on. The US economy is facing a great deal of uncertainty at the moment, isn't it? With the Federal Reserve beginning to bring interest rates down, but hurricanes coming in and having a strong economic impact, strikes taking place. How do you see the outlook?
Well, you're absolutely right that there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty right now. And we've seen that, for example, in the latest investment manager index reports, where people are essentially keeping their powder dry until a lot of the issues that you just mentioned, whether it's the hurricanes or the strikes, until those issues have really worked themselves out and we have a better direction as to where we're headed. There's also a lot of political uncertainty. You mentioned the Federal Reserve. We also have a major election coming up in November, and the two different presidential candidates have incredibly different views as to which way they want to take public policy. One is a very pro-growth, low-tax agenda, for example, and on the other side, we have a high-tax and hyper-regulatory agenda. And how you want to invest is going to be very, very different depending on which of those you end up getting.
And really interestingly and very unusually, we've got the test bed, haven't we? Because we had 4 years of Trumponomics followed by 4 years of Bidenomics. And it's very clear which one actually worked and led to the strongest economic growth.
That's exactly right. That's such a great point. We're at a very unique moment in modern American political history. Typically, voters have either both candidates with no record, just promises, or they have only one candidate who actually has a record in executive office. But right now, as you just pointed out, we have both candidates with a record. We have the Trump historical record and we have the Biden-Harris historical record. And so voters, interestingly, don't even have to so much listen to the promises that each candidate is making. They can simply look at the record, not the rhetoric. They can see under which president, for example, their inflation-adjusted incomes went up and under which one they went down.
And the stunning success of Trump's reduction in corporation tax, his general approach to taxation, the boost that gave to economic growth, and his restraint of the federal budget, not necessarily as much restraint as you might have liked, but at least coming under bounds, compared to Biden wanting high taxes and his inappropriate named Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually about massive subsidies to uneconomic green industries.
Absolutely. That's 100% correct. And what we have seen under the Inflation Reduction Act, which was supposed to, for example, increase manufacturing jobs, we were supposed to be building solar panels and windmills here in the United States. Instead, the manufacturing sector has been in recession in the United States, even if the broader economy necessarily isn't. We have lost over 130,000 manufacturing jobs, for example, in this country since the beginning of 2023. So this idea that somehow these policies have helped the economy, they've done exactly the opposite. They have taken things backwards. And you're absolutely right, going back to that Trump economic record, for example, with tax cuts, that was one way in which he was able to boost economic growth. And although things like the debt grew, if you look at the cost to actually service that debt, especially relative to the size of the economy, it didn't go up. It went down. It's much like a household that goes out and they get a bigger mortgage. They take on more debt, but at the same time, their income grows and those monthly payments on that mortgage are very sustainable.
And it seemed to me that President Trump understands that fundamental issue for all economies throughout all time, that they are successful if they have a low cost of energy, which is the exact reverse of the Democrats who seem to have drunk the green ideology Kool-Aid.
Exactly. And this is one of the key reasons why energy prices simply cannot come down in this country right now. The only reason that we have such high energy production, whether it's oil or natural gas in America today, is because of the elevated price level. If those prices start coming down, producers are simply going to have to cut back because under today's tax and more importantly, regulatory environment imposed by the Biden-Harris administration, you can't drill oil profitably at 40 or $50 a barrel, let's say. Conversely, under the Trump administration, you could. And so not only were drillers pumping a lot of oil at $70 or $80 a barrel, but even when oil was down at 40 or 50, they were still able to do so profitably. And that, by the way, doesn't just benefit America, it benefits the world, because there are a lot of bad actors in the world, Iran, for example, who rely on high energy prices to fund terrorism. And when you can bring down oil prices, since that's not simply a local commodity, it's a global commodity, you end up putting pressure on a lot of those bad international actors too.
Indeed. Well, I hope you'll have some sympathy for the poor old UK, because our electricity prices are between 2 and 3 times yours, because we've got to an even worse state in the green ideology than you have. So we need you to carry on producing cheap energy to help the world. Moving on to the Federal Reserve, do you think it's good at its job?
No, not at all. It has been absolutely terrible. The Federal Reserve was created allegedly to prevent inflation and deflation, to prevent panics. And since the inception of the Federal Reserve, we have had the worst inflation. We have had the worst financial panics in our nation's history. The stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed did not happen before the Federal Reserve. And you can look at throughout the 20th century, even into the 21st, when we had the dot-com collapse, when we had the housing bubble, and now we have almost like an everything bubble. All of these massive financial swings did not happen before we had a Federal Reserve in this country. So no, I can't say they're good at their job. Unfortunately, they're exactly the opposite. Part of the reason for that is they are subject to so much political pressure. They are not politically independent, and they are not data dependent. We have seen that repeatedly the last several years, where the data say that the Fed should do one thing, except they turn around and do something radically different. Why? Because it's politically convenient. Most recently, even though inflation is not back to the 2% target, they cut by 50 basis points, something that's usually reserved for more of an emergency scenario. Well, in this case, the emergency is an election.
Which is really interesting, because I remember before I was a politician, I was active in the financial service markets, that the Federal Reserve famously did not change interest rates shortly before an election. But this year, it's done it, and it's done it in spades, which seems to me to be such obvious political interference of a nominally independent central bank.
And given the amount of criticism that the central bank has faced from the challenger in this presidential election, I think it's very clear that they are trying to make sure that he does not win, because if he does, it's very likely he's going to want to clean house at America's central bank.
I completely agree with you on central banks. I think there's this mythology that's built up that they are a group of wise men who understand the economy, and if you take it out of politics, it will be done much better. The truth is they're just as political as the politicians, but they're put on a pedestal, so they get away with making terrible mistakes, which is how we got the inflation over the last couple of years anyway, and just aren't accountable. Nobody can vote them out.
That's exactly right. And when we hear, for example, former President Trump talk about how he wants more accountability at the Fed, and he actually wants the politicians to have more say in the process of setting monetary policy, a lot of people are outraged at that, and they say, no, we need an independent central bank. You don't have an independent central bank now. I would much rather have a central bank which, if it's going to be involved in politics, is also accountable through the political process. And that means holding them accountable to voters. Right now, there is no accountability to voters when it comes to the Federal Reserve. In the United States, they have to vote for politicians who only once every 4 years get a say in determining Fed policy.
Indeed. Well, I remember learning American history many, many years ago, and learning about Nicholas Biddle, who was the governor of the Bank of the United States, who fell out with the then president and deliberately ruined the economy. I've never thought from then on that you could trust central bankers to be such impartial fountains of wisdom. They have their own biases and failures. But another Biden issue is he's just given in to the port workers and suggested they get a 62% pay increase. Is this the Democrats paying off their union paymasters?
Well, we have to remember that the vast majority of union donations go to Democrats. There's this kind of unholy alliance there where the Democrats are setting policy that even if it doesn't actually benefit union members, it does benefit union leadership. And that's important because union leadership are the ones directing those campaign contributions. And so, again, it's this kind of unholy alliance where the Democrats put policies in place which may not benefit union members, but increase the amount of money available to the union leaders who then make those campaign contributions back to those same Democrats. And this is one of the reasons why we get so many bizarre labor agreements in this country that are backed by the politicians in power. One of the things, for example, that the union is pushing for is to essentially ban any kind of automation at US ports. Well, US ports right now are essentially the most inefficient in the developed world. That's appalling when we have so much technology here in the United States. But the reason for that, again, has to do with the labor agreements that are entered into. And it has to do with the fact that the politicians, particularly on the left in this country, back those agreements. But at the end of the day, it's not to the benefit of workers.
And it's a great opportunity, should Trump get in, to get rid of these restrictive practices and to improve productivity, because although the US has done much better relatively to the European Union or to the United Kingdom in productivity growth in recent years, a lack of productivity growth has been a besetting problem for Western economies.
That's absolutely correct. And one of the really sad things is the fact that productivity is what really drives wage growth at the end of the day. And so the fact that these workers are increasingly less productive means they're going to have lower wages. The only reason that the dock workers, as an example, can command such high wages is that they keep out workers. They ban people from getting jobs. And so you're reducing the number of jobs in order to artificially keep up wage rates. It'd be much better if we automated all these ports and we actually created more jobs than we lost, and the workers were able to get higher wages because of that enhanced productivity. When we started switching in this country from people in toll booths on highways into an automated system, a lot of those toll workers lost their jobs, but then they were able to get new jobs working in call centers, for example. So they went from sitting in an open air booth, essentially, where they were subject to all kinds of elements, whether that's heat in the summer or freezing cold in the winter. They were having to breathe exhaust fumes all day long. And now they get to sit in air conditioned offices and answer phones. And again, there are more of them employed in that job than previously. So you saved money for the consumer, who now pays less in tolls. The people get paid more money as workers in air-conditioned offices, and they have better working conditions.
Yes, the difficulty, though, for politicians on this is that we know which jobs will be destroyed, but we don't know the jobs that will be created. We know jobs will be created because historically they always have been, but we don't know which ones. And that makes it very tempting for politicians to say, let's preserve the old jobs.
That's very true. And I would add to that the fact that very oftentimes the jobs that get eliminated are unionized and the jobs that get created are not. And so now all of a sudden you don't have that revolving money door, if you will, where these people are paying union dues, which go to the union bosses, which then go to the Democrats in campaign contributions, who then promise to put policies in place that will increase wages for a very small number of workers. So as soon as you break down that entire mechanism, all of a sudden that huge incentive is gone. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that these left-wing politicians are trying so hard to stop that process in its infancy.
Now, one other thing I wanted to ask you about was the economic effect of the hurricanes. Now, when people's lives are being shattered, and indeed some people are dying, it always seems rather tactless to talk about the economic consequences of something. But nonetheless, two hurricanes in short order will have an economic effect. How big will that be, and how quickly will the Florida economy recover?
It's likely going to be measured in the billions of dollars, unfortunately, between the hurricane that went up the Appalachian Mountains here in the United States, and then also the one that is now going through Florida. And you're absolutely right. The primary concern here is obviously people's lives, not the dollars. But we have to remember, at the end of the day, the reason the dollars are important is what you can do with those dollars, right? You can create all kinds of medical advancements, for example. You can save lives. And so as you reduce that money that's available available to be spent, we have to keep in mind that that has an impact on people's lives as well. In terms of how quickly can Florida rebuild itself, as long as the human capital is untouched, that's what really matters. We saw this famously in Western Europe after World War II compared to Eastern Europe. Both had been bombed into smithereens, except because the human capital was preserved better in Western Europe, and because it was free to invent, because it was free to invest, those economies developed much faster and recovered much faster than they did under or I should say, behind the Iron Curtain, as Churchill called it. And so I think at the end of the day, Florida is going to be just fine. They will recover relatively quickly, as they have from previous hurricanes, because that is a very free state.
And do you think there are any political consequences? I saw a Republican had said that the Democrats were deliberately sending hurricanes to Republican states, which I assume must have been a joke of some kind, that people can't really believe that, can they?
I don't think people actually believe that. I hope they don't anyway. But I mean, whatever the case, look, I think it's pretty clear as Scripture tells us that the rain falls on the just and the unjust. So I don't think there's really any indication here that the weather is affecting one political group differently from another.
That little quotation continues: "The rain falls on the just and on the unjust fella, but it falls more on the just, for the unjust stealeth his umbrella." Which I'm not sure our viewers are expecting my bad puns at this stage in the conversation. So overall, where do you think the economy is before the election, and which of the two candidates does it help the most?
Well, I think the economy is actually doing very poorly, much worse than the official numbers make it appear. I actually recently published some research with the Brownstone Institute, where a colleague of mine, another economist, Peter St. Onge, we essentially looked at the different inflation metrics that are used in order to essentially adjust down the economy. So, for example, if prices everywhere double, that's not a doubling of economic activity, it's just a doubling of prices. And so we have to adjust these numbers like gross domestic product for inflation. Well, the official numbers have had a lot of significant statistical issues over the last several years. And so we tried to correct for those issues in this report. And what we found, shockingly, is that the economy today is actually, by our estimates, smaller than it was at the start of 2019. In other words, so much of what looks like additional economic activity is really just higher prices, which aren't being captured by the official inflation metrics. And I think this is why, when we look at polls of the American people, they respond with over half of them saying we are in recession today. In other words, people's own personal finances have deteriorated to a point that they can buy less than they could before. They can afford a lower standard of living than they could before. And the result of that is people think the economy is in recession. Well, according to our research, it may very well be just that. And so who does this benefit? I think, as is the case in any election, when the economy is not doing well, it benefits the challenger, not the incumbent.
It's the famous Ronald Reagan question, isn't it, which Donald Trump can now ask: are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And if the answer is no, that's very powerful for him.
Absolutely. That's 100% correct. And I think what's really interesting and really very telling is that in so many interviews now, when the Democrat candidate, Vice President Harris, has been asked, are people better off today than they were 4 years ago? She has yet to directly answer that question. Instead, she starts talking about how she was raised in a middle-class family and they had green lawns. I'm not exaggerating. It's a complete non sequitur, but that's how she's answering these questions. She can't answer them directly. Again, I think because the answer would be so damning.
Well, Dr. Antoni, thank you so much for joining me on GBNAmerica. It's much appreciated, and for your many insights. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.